Working under someone who insisted on scheduling mandatory team meetings at 8 p.m. on Friday nights was my introduction to incompetent leadership. He'd demand everyone stay late to discuss things that could have been emailed, claiming face-to-face communication was essential for trust building. Meanwhile, he'd sit there half asleep, barely participating, then schedule follow-up meetings to discuss what was supposedly discussed. People started quitting. My boss had this brilliant strategy of micromanaging every single task while simultaneously taking credit for all successful projects. He'd breathe down your neck about comma placement in emails, then waltz into meetings claiming responsibility for your work. When projects failed, suddenly we were the incompetent ones. His performance reviews for himself always described him as a visionary leader. There was this manager I worked for who believed yelling was motivation. Loud, public yelling about minor mistakes, missing commas, slightly slow project timelines. He'd call team meetings just to scream about someone's typo. Then he wondered why morale was terrible and people were actively job hunting. He genuinely thought volume equaled effectiveness. Somehow my manager thought the best way to handle employee concerns was to schedule surprise interrogation sessions disguised as one-on-ones. You'd sit down thinking it was casual chat, then she'd blindside you with accusations about your productivity, your attitude, your commitment level. Nothing was ever a normal conversation. Everything was combative. She'd take notes while staring at you suspiciously. Then there's the manager who implemented a policy that everyone had to smile while working because it affects energy levels and productivity. Literally required facial expressions. She'd walk around monitoring people's faces, making comments if anyone looked too serious. When someone explained smiling doesn't increase work quality, she claimed they had a bad attitude. She documented the non-smilers in her notes. This one time, my boss decided the office needed a loyalty test, so he would randomly ask employees what they were doing and where, then compare stories to see if anyone was lying about their whereabouts. He thought he'd discovered some massive conspiracy when 3 people were in different parts of the office simultaneously doing different tasks. He became paranoid about employee movement patterns. My previous manager kept a spreadsheet tracking how many minutes each employee spent at their desk versus bathroom breaks. She'd create graphs showing bathroom frequency and present them in team meetings, shamming people publicly for their bodily functions. When someone pointed out this was invasive, she claimed it was about bathroom break accountability. She was literally documenting pee breaks. Working with a manager who held meetings about why there hadn't been enough meetings. She felt the team wasn't communicating enough, so she scheduled a meeting to discuss meeting frequency, which led to scheduling more meetings, which then required meetings to track if the new meetings were effective. By the end, most work time was spent in meetings about meetings. There was this boss who would send employee emails to other employees with critical comments before sending them to the intended recipient. He'd forward an email asking for clarification while adding his own sarcastic commentary to third parties. Then the original sender would find out everyone in the office had read his criticism. He thought this was clever management. My manager had the policy that nobody could leave before her, so she'd sit at her desk doing absolutely nothing just so she could stay late and prevent people from going home. She'd spend the last hour of work refreshing her email and adjusting office supplies. People would finish their work at 4 p.m. but couldn't leave until 6 because she refused to leave. Productivity meant sitting in chairs waiting. Somehow I worked for a boss who believed the company was being sabotaged by an unknown enemy and would frequently announce emergency meetings about finding the saboteur. He'd accuse different people each week, then apologize when it was someone else. By month 3, everyone was under suspicion simultaneously. He genuinely believed there was a conspiracy against the company. My boss decided that employee burnout was actually just lack of entertainment, so he started forcing team-building exercises at the most random times. Mid-project, team building, tight deadline, team building. Nobody signed up for painting class at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, but somehow it was mandatory. He'd get upset if people weren't enthusiastic about doing crafts when they had actual work. There was this manager who would make decisions then immediately contradict them. He'd announce a new process, people would implement it. Then he'd say that wasn't what he meant, and it was the wrong approach. Nobody could ever do things right because the right way kept changing. When people asked for clarification, he'd say they should just understand his vision without being told explicitly. Working for someone who thought motivational speeches from business podcasts should be mandatory listening for the entire team. He'd play them during work time, force everyone to listen, then ask people to share their takeaways. When people mentioned they could work instead, he'd say prioritizing motivation was essential. His podcast selections made no sense for our field. My previous boss kept a detailed log of every mistake employees made and would randomly bring them up months later in conversations. You'd be discussing a new project, and he'd suddenly mention a typo from 6 months ago. He treated past mistakes like they were current offenses. Nobody knew when irrelevant history would become relevant again. There was this manager who would schedule meetings and then not show up, but also wouldn't cancel them. You'd sit in the conference room waiting for 30 minutes before concluding he forgot. Then he'd apologize via email the next day as if that was adequate. By the 100th time, people just stopped attending because attendance was pointless. My boss implemented a system where everyone had to track their time in 15-minute increments throughout the day, logging what they were doing every quarter hour. Bathroom break, log it. Thinking about a project, log it. Getting water, log it. She'd review the logs looking for suspicious patterns. It became such a tedious task that actual work suffered. Working under a manager who believed friendship was a management tool. He'd insist you go to his house for parties, text him about your personal life, and generally blur all professional boundaries. When you maintained work-life separation, he'd claim you didn't respect him. He'd bring up your declining to attend his birthday party during performance reviews. My manager had this habit of sending emails in the middle of the night and then acting confused when people hadn't responded first thing in the morning. He'd send work demands at 2 a.m. on Tuesday and expect completion by 8 a.m. When people pointed out this was unreasonable, he claimed they lacked dedication. He worked odd hours and expected everyone to match his schedule. There was this boss who would make promises about raises, promotions, and bonuses, then conveniently forget these conversations ever happened. When you'd bring up the promised raise 6 months later, he'd act like you were making it up. He had zero documentation because discussing compensation verbally meant he could deny everything later. My previous manager decided feedback could only be given while yelling in hallways. He'd wait until you were walking past colleagues, then loudly criticize something you did while people watched uncomfortably. He thought public humiliation was constructive feedback. When you'd ask for privacy, he'd claim honesty shouldn't be hidden. Working for a boss who believed showing up physically was more important than actual productivity. He'd scrutinize arrival times but not care about work quality. Someone could produce nothing all week but arrive at 7:45 a.m. and he'd praise their commitment. Someone could complete all their work by noon, but that seemed suspicious to him. My manager implemented a rule that all emails had to be copied to him, even internal communications between teammates. He read every single message, often adding unnecessary comments or corrections. Privacy didn't exist. He'd interrupt normal workflow with emails about email formatting. People started having work conversations in person specifically to avoid his email surveillance. There was this boss who would ask you a question, you'd answer, then he'd act like you never explained anything. He'd repeat the question, you'd give the same answer, then he'd sigh like you were being deliberately unhelpful. He genuinely didn't listen the first time but somehow expected you to give different answers repeatedly. My previous manager thought the solution to any problem was more meetings with more people. Missed deadline. Bring in 5 extra people to discuss it. Communication issue. Add 8 more people to the conversation. His meeting rosters would expand until the original problem got lost in the bureaucracy. Nobody could remember why half the people were even in these meetings. Working under someone who treated employee mistakes like personal betrayals. Someone missed a deadline and he'd talk about how disappointed he was, how the team had let him down, as if work failures were about his feelings. Everything became emotional drama instead of practical problem solving. He'd pout when things went wrong instead of figuring out solutions. My boss had this system where he'd tell you something was wrong but refuse to explain what or how to fix it. He'd say your report was incomplete. You'd ask what was missing. He'd say you should know. This continued until you eventually guessed what he meant. He thought vagueness was clever management instead of just creating confusion. There was this manager who would announce company-wide changes via Facebook post instead of official channels. Nobody knew whether to believe this was real or if it was personal social media. He seemed to think his personal Facebook account was the appropriate place for business communications. People would miss important information because they weren't scrolling his personal feed. My previous manager kept an enemies list and would frequently remind people they were on it. He'd point out who had disappointed him, who he considered disloyal, who would never be promoted. He'd discuss his enemies list like it was normal management practice. People lived in fear of being added to it, which basically meant doing whatever he wanted. Working for a boss who believed employee happiness was irrelevant to productivity. He'd minimize any complaints about workload, schedule, or working conditions by saying life is hard, so get over it. When retention became a problem, he blamed the employees for being soft instead of examining his management style. My manager implemented a mandatory fun policy where everyone had to appear happy at work or face consequences. Resting face. He'd ask what was wrong. Quiet demeanor. He'd criticize your attitude. People had to perform happiness constantly or risk negative reviews. The irony was the mandatory fun made everyone miserable. There was this boss who would promise flexibility, then punish people for using it. You could work from home, but he'd send text messages during evening hours, then wonder why you didn't respond immediately. He offered flexible schedules but got upset if you weren't at your desk at 9 a.m. The flexibility was fake. My previous manager thought the best way to motivate people was through public comparison. He'd announce performance rankings in team meetings, shame the lowest performers, and praise top performers. He created an incredibly toxic competitive environment where people wouldn't help each other because success meant beating colleagues. Working under a boss who refused to make decisions and instead asked staff what to do, then acted disappointed in their suggestions. He'd outsource decision-making to people below him, then criticize the outcomes. When things went wrong, it was the staff's fault for suggesting the wrong path. He got to avoid responsibility while maintaining authority.